Welcome everybody. One of the things I think we all know is that we live in really challenging times, and I was just sharing a story about the fact that I was in Shanghai recently, and it brought home to me how incredibly lucky we are in Australia. But there's nothing saying that in 10 or 20 years' time that doesn't change with growing population, and you'd want to hope that we don't have to live in some of the conditions that they are living in because of their population growth. They have problems with resource depletion, terrible congestion. Even at 1 o'clock in the morning, you'll still get terrible congestion in and around Shanghai. They have water pollution, they have energy problems. There's a lot of issues that they're dealing with, and one of the biggest focuses they're looking at is their existing buildings and what they're doing with their existing sittings and how they make them more sustainable. So they're lessons that we can learn because we desperately need to do the same thing in Australia. So many of you have seen this figure. It's one that we use a lot, showing that 23% of due to buildings contribute to greenhouse gas emissions in Australia. And then internationally, obviously our impact on energy and waste is very high. The point I'm trying to make is buildings have a massive impact on our environment and we need to do something about it. And it's really our existing buildings that are doing this. The next area that I will be talking about later in my presentation is cities. Buildings are just part of a city. So not only should we look at our buildings as singular buildings, we need to look at our buildings within a community, and including our homes within a neighbourhood and our buildings within a city. And it really is the next area that we need to be focusing on, because it's all well and good that we put our focus just on our buildings, but buildings can talk to each other and we can get much better efficiencies between our buildings. So Australia's building sector. We really do contribute a lot to the economy, both in our construction, our workforce and what we do. But one of the things we should note is that 81% of office buildings are more than 10 years old. And that's a lot of office buildings we need. That's just office buildings. So I'm not talking about schools, hospitals, shopping centres. That's just office buildings. So there's a lot of old stock out there that needs to be retrofitted. Now the older stock, the old heritage buildings are actually some fantastic opportunities in greening them because of the way they were built. You get some really good embodied energy in those buildings, and the mass of those buildings makes heritage buildings a great opportunity. But our newer old buildings are really a challenge to us in retrofitting the grid. But buildings are an opportunity. And many of you, I know, have seen the quote coming out of UNEP saying that no other sector has such a high potential for such dramatic emissions reductions are our buildings. Davis Langdon has released a report that was released at Green Cities this year that showed that if we focused on buildings over 20 years old, that we could achieve an improvement in their NABERS rating just from energy efficiency that we put into those buildings, and I will talk about what that is in a minute. So buildings have a lot of opportunity. We can just do the quick fixes, which is the lighting, fixtures and fittings in a building, or we could do a whole refurbishment. And the Davis Langdon report showed that by choosing which methods and technologies you used in those buildings, the opportunities that you would receive. Now, what I think is noticeable is the complete refurbishment of a building gives you 56% reduction in CO2 and 69% reduction in water use. And those figures consistently come out when there's new and existing buildings that have been refurbished. So the opportunities are there to reduce emissions in our buildings. Another report that recently came out was the Climate Works Low Carbon Growth Plan. The only point I want to show you here is we can do this using technology that's available today. And in some cases it's technology that's been around for years. So we don't have to go out and look for innovative new technology to retrofit our buildings. The technology is already there, and in this report it outlines what some of those technologies are. The second plank is a report by ASBEC, ASBEC is the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, and it's an association of associations. And what we do is, the whole aim is we all get together to pool our money to do joint reports. And the second plank was written because the CPRS was the first plank. And we felt that the built environment should be the most important sector looked at, and that we were missed out, and we were considered the second plank. And then in New Zealand a couple of years ago, Rudd talked about the second plank, energy efficiency and the importance of the second plank. So ASBEC jumped on that and said, right, we're going to do a report on and call it the second plank. But we also realised that CPRS wasn't going to be the be-all and end-all for the building sector. If you just focused on, if there was no CPRS but you just focused on energy and efficiency in the building sector, we were still going to have great wins. And the report, the new report that we've just released, shows that. So it shows that there can be additional energy efficiency measures that can reduce emissions. And what it showed, that by pursuing additional energy efficiency, the sector could contribute to reductions. It also could contribute to reduced costs. One of the biggest things here was delaying the need for expanding the electricity grid. That's one of the big things, to try and stop being so focused on carbon and more coal-fired power generation. We want to delay that, and by looking at our buildings and making our buildings more efficient, that's one of the opportunities we have. So we don't have to build more coal-fired power stations. And we were talking about, Jan and I were talking about one this morning, and Hunter Valley, if you know about that in north of Sydney. We don't want more. So if our buildings are more efficient, we can try and contain that. The other thing the second plank found is that it introduces other benefits, and I know many of you know this, but it assists with the adaptation of making buildings cope better with extreme conditions. And there's no more that's been showing in the last couple of years in the heat that we've been getting in our cities, and then in some cases cyclones, floods, bushfires, you name the terrible climatic and extreme conditions we've been getting. The health benefits go without saying. I'm in a green space. It's both Green Star and Neighbours, which Blythe O'Neill was the designer of. And we've done a productivity analysis, and it has come back to say that our staff much more prefer better ventilation, the fact that we've got more fresh air and that we have better daylight. And they work better, and it's a much more enjoyable environment, and productivity improvements, obviously. So let's just put existing buildings in a national context. There are many drivers for existing buildings. It really does depend on the owner of the building or the asset type. So, for instance, if you look at the universities, what's driving them to green up the universities is very different to a school, is then very different to a shopping centre and different to an office. And that makes it very complex for us in our industry, but it really is a great opportunity. Cost of utilities would have to be one of the biggest ones. So shopping centres really do look at the cost of their utilities, and that's one of the reasons they're looking at retrofitting their energy and water. The cost of not going green. In many of the building stocks, there's so many opportunities now for green office buildings that those buildings that aren't really are they're in obsolescence. They need to look at retrofitting, and there's some fantastic examples of retrofitting existing buildings to be able to compete with new buildings. There's government incentives, and the building code is consistently ramping up in office buildings. So really there's no excuse. Obviously NGERS, and there was a second release report this week, renewable energy target, green leases. All the federal government and state governments have agreed to a national green lease. Mandatory disclosure came through the Senate 3 weeks ago. So there is now a mandatory disclosure requirement on lease or sale of any office building in Australia over 2,000 square metres. You have to disclose your energy performance on your building. So you can imagine if you've got a 4.5-star neighbours and your mate next door's got 3-star neighbours, where are the tenants going to go? And the other one is there is a massive rating tool uptake in Australia. This is Green Star. Just for those of you who don't know Green Star is an environmental rating system. It's a holistic system that looks at 8 categories. So when we talk about a Green Star building, and there's going to be a number of examples today, just think about it doesn't just look at energy, it looks at 8 categories. And buildings have to achieve credits across the 8 categories. So when you think of the washing machine or the dishwasher and you've got your star rating, this is a similar thing for buildings, but they have to get the 8 categories to get their stars, 4, 5 or 6. So there is a refurbishment trend in Australia. We can do better, but there is. This is just an example of some of the buildings that have been refurbished, that are existing buildings. And some of these are heritage buildings as well, like the Bushels Warehouse and 39 Hunter Street, are heritage building with this beautiful sandstone mass that have created some fantastic mass of the building to achieve the heating and cooling that they need. But I'm just making a case. There are already examples out there. People can't say it hasn't been done. I'm just going to talk very quickly on 500 Collins Street because this is a gorgeous building. We happen to live there in Melbourne. But one of the lovely things about this building is the owner did it while the building was tenanted. So 80% of the tenants were still in the building and they just moved the tenants between the floors as they retrofitted the floors. It's a 30-year-old building and it's 28 floors. The old floors, you know, your typical, you know, we've all been in there, really dark, you can't see outside, that terrible, you know, by 3 o'clock you get the, oh, I want to go to sleep. Just that typical office building we see in many of our buildings in Australia. And then you look at the new floors where they've retrofitted and used chill beam instead of traditional air conditioning. They've opened the building out so you get this fantastic daylight coming in. The materials they've put in the building. And so in a real building you can see the differences. What they're also able to do is productivity analysis, because people were in with the building, they moved them and they brought them back into their floor again after it had been refurbished. So they're able to do some really good studies on people within the same building. And it was shown, now don't laugh, it's a law firm, it was shown that secretaries' typing speeds increased, lawyers' billing times were more efficient, and so for a law firm that's obviously very good, and sick days decreased. So for a law firm, they're the productivity that they're looking at. But this is a wonderful example of a staged refurbishment of a tenanted building. The next one is the Stocklands fit out. This has done some great things to show what you can do in Sydney. We're called Baby Stocklands because we use the same designers and we're just a smaller version. The other one is the Good Shed, which is in Melbourne, and it's a fantastic heritage building where the Building Commission and Vic Urban are based, and this is a great example of a refurbished fit-out. The next one is Empire State Building, but Rob's going to talk about that, so I'm not going to dwell on that. What I will dwell on is the fact that governments are increasing their focus in this area. Jan and I were having a really good discussion before, and she was saying, oh, you know, it doesn't seem that governments are focusing on the building sector, and in the non-residential market, they certainly are. They are in the residential, but let me tell you, in the non-residential market, especially when the CPRS was canned, all the focus came on buildings. Like, Rob and I have not been busier, literally. Every week we're doing a submission, every week we're attending down at Canberra, attending a meeting. All the focus is right on us. But just buildings aren't that sexy, so you don't see it a lot in the print. But we are right in their limelight. And I'm just leaving that here to show you where they're looking at us in many ways. The other interesting thing to note is they're going beyond office and residential. They will be focusing on schools, hospitals and shopping centres. It is in their mandate of what they're going to be focusing on next. So this government is looking at the cities and communities and precincts that we all now, we obviously live in. They've gone beyond buildings, and this is a trend that's happening internationally as well. They created the Major Cities Unit, and last year in December, they released under COAG, Council of Australian Governments, the Capital City Strategic Planning Systems criteria. And these are the criteria that they're looking at. Every single capital city has to meet these criteria by 2012 or it'll start impacting them on the funding that they receive. And Green Building Council has started creating Green Star communities that many of you have heard about. So cities can lead the way, and it's the focus that will be the focus of this decade. Cities are made up of existing buildings. Local governments are focusing on cities, as we've just heard from City of Melbourne on the 1,200 building project, and there are many challenges that we have to face with our cities. So Green Building Council of Australia is working with the industry and all government land agencies around Australia, so Vic Urban, ULDA. We're working with all the land agencies on Green Star communities. And it's going beyond environmental. We're looking at livability, governance, economic, and design and place. And it really is about the places that we're living in. Barangaroo is just one example of a Green Star community project coming through, and that's that slither of land in Sydney. That's an urban renewal project, and they'll be using the Green Star Communities project. So finally, what can you do right now? There are simple things that you can do. For instance, I noticed that here they don't do recycling because I went to find one up the back and they're 2 bins. It's just simple. 2 bins. Just put in a recycling. There's some simple things that we can do with our lightings in our building when we're refurbishing and retrofitting, the water fixtures and fittings that we do in our buildings, the materials. Think about the materials you put in a building. If you're doing a simple thing as just repainting, think about the paint that you buy, because you can get low VOC paint. You know that terrible smell you get? You shouldn't be smelling your paint. Think of the impact you're going to have on people, especially with asthma. There's some fantastic products out there now, green products, that are freely available that we can put in our buildings. So finally, the easiest wins is removing and replacing inefficient equipment, and also to retrofit heating, ventilation and cooling, and upgrading appliances. Thank you.